the record button. So we're on, and welcome everybody. Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're at in the world right now. And welcome to our second AskTOM office hours session focused on spatial technologies in Spatial and Graph. Today our focus topic, Carol, so we can go ahead with the cover slide. Thanks.
Yeah.
So today our focus topic is our new visual tool, Oracle Spatial Studio, fast and easy spatial analytics and maps. I'm Jean Im. I'm on the Oracle Spatial and Graph product management team, and happy to have two of our product management colleagues presenting on the studio today, Palmer and David Lapp. Carol manages a wide range of product release responsibilities for Spatial and Graph with focus on the cloud technologies, and she also works very closely with customers and partners in our SIG interest group. David works on strategy and planning for our Spatial and Graph technologies. He has a wide range of experience also working with customers, and additionally, he presents regularly at developer conferences. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping notes. We do have your lines muted. Please do use the chat box to ask your questions. The main goal of AskTOM office hours is to give you a chance to talk to product management and developers directly so that we can help you out with whatever is on your mind on the technologies or roadblocks you're stumbling on. So don't be shy on that. We'll be monitoring that throughout the session, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. But do remember that we can't discuss SRs or bug reports or specific licensing issues during the call. And keep in mind, if you post code into chat, everyone can see that content unless you direct it specifically to the hosts. So Carol, next slide, please.
Okay.
Thank you. This is our second AskTOM session where we're focusing on the spatial and mapping technologies in Oracle Database. We've also had many previous sessions on graph technologies. At the URL posted on the slide, that'll take you to the AskTOM landing page. You can find recordings of sessions from the past. You can also submit feedback, questions, requests for future topics, view the schedule of upcoming session dates and topics, and sign up for the email list. So with that, I'll hand it over to Carol.
Okay, thank you, Jean. So as Jean said, Carol Palmer, product manager for Spatial and Graph, along with David Lapp. We're going to be talking primarily about Spatial Studio today. Here's the agenda. What we thought we'd do, though, for those who may be not familiar with Spatial Graph, is just give a couple slides on what Spatial Graph is all about, then dive into Studio. The focus really of this hour really will be on the demo, so David will be doing that. That'll take up most of the time. We'll look at functionality of Studio, licensing requirements, technical requirements, how to get started, and V1 limitations. And when we say V1 limitations here, Studio is really a robust application. However, in any V1 rollout, there's always a few things that you might want to be aware of. So we just want to point those out to you. Safe harbor statement is here only because for Studio, it's been released probably about 5 or 6 weeks ago right now, so it's fairly new. Hopefully some of you have been able to try it, but we may be talking about some enhancements here, so that's the safe harbor statement. Okay, for Spatial and Graph, again, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's an option to Oracle Database. It's been around for a while. It's available on cloud platforms and subscriptions as well as on-prem. Spatial and Graph, there's a spatial side and the graph side, and I think there's been a lot of AskTOM sessions on graph, not so many on spatial, but we are not focusing on graph today at all. It's really cool functionality, a lot of cool things, but there's no time for that, so it's really going to be spatial. So Spatial and Graph's the umbrella. Studio falls under the umbrella. Spatial has been in Oracle Database for decades. It's a premier platform out there, very robust, store and manage and analyze your data in the database. We also have the Oracle Big Data Spatial and Graph platform, so components of spatial on the Big Data platform in Spark, Hadoop, and NoSQL. Here is the big picture of Spatial and Graph. So we have these spatial data types, the basic ones, points, lines, polygons. Again, all in the database, as well as more advanced data types and features. We have networks, geofencing. So if you want to track something, for example, coming in and out of a particular area or region, that's available to you. We have georaster, 3D LiDAR. On the spatial graph side, we offer 3D graphs, property graphs. They've been out for a long time as well. On the top, you see the deployable components that you get with Spatial and Graph option. So we have a spatial map visualization component that's available, geocoding, routing, web services, and you see Studio joins the deployable components at the top there as well. And I hear someone in the background, just to let you know it's being recorded. Somehow I'm hearing you. Okay, also we have, so spatial is a native geospatial data type, again, stored in Oracle database, along with all your other data. We have native spatial indexing for fast access to spatial data. And spatial analysis is through standard SQL. Now what you'll see in Studio is you can see this analysis behind the scenes. And you also, if you're just a general business user, you don't need to see this SQL at all. I'll show you that. Again, we've been around for a long time on the spatial side, hundreds of spatial operators and functions, just thousands of customers worldwide. So we have a lot of capabilities available in the spatial platform. Okay, so that was just a quick overview of Spatial and Graph. What is Spatial Studio? Spatial Studio is a self-service app to make it easy to use the spatial features in Oracle database. All about spatial visualization and analysis. And we've designed it to make it easy for business users who have no GIS or spatial knowledge. So if you are familiar with Oracle Data Visualization or Oracle Analytics Cloud, we've modeled our user experience, our UI, after those products. So if you're using them today, it should be easy for you to use Spatial Studio. What we've tried to do and why we designed this product is to simplify things. It's not so developer-oriented, it's self-service. So you can prepare data for spatial analysis, such as the geocoding, as I mentioned. You can easily access spatial analysis operations. You don't have to know database syntax to do that. You can create spatial visualizations, and right now we offer two, table visualization as well as a map visualization, and there'll be more to come, of course. You can share results with others. You can share results with DB. I'll show you how to do that, and you can do that through REST. Here is the URL for Spatial Studio on Oracle.com. Let me just go to the live version. There it is. You can get started very easily by going to this page. You can download Spatial Studio, see a video, FAQs, documentation is here. And what I just wanted to point out is on the bottom, the forum is available to you. Should you have any questions, concerns, put them there and we'll be able to get back to you because we monitor that on a regular basis. And of course, there's a blog here for tips and tricks. So that's another great source for more information. Yeah. Okay, so with that, it's time for the demo and I'll stop sharing, David, so you can move forward now.
Thanks, Carol. And let's see, Carol, can you just confirm you can hear my audio?
I can see you.
All right. And let me share. And then if you could just confirm.
Seeing the desert.
Seeing the desert? Okay. All right, I'm going to move to the desert screen. How's that?
Yep. Perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to share a demo that's just going to go through a bunch of the essential functionality of Studio, just sort of an overview, and hopefully sort of give folks an orientation to how you use Studio for some of the use cases that you'll have. And so just to start, I am simply logging into the Studio application, and the very first thing that we'll do is just take a quick look through the pages that the Studio application contains. So the big broad brush message here is that everything that we're going to do in this Studio application is all about making it easier to use the features of Oracle Spatial that are sort of behind the scenes back in the database that exist and are really robust and powerful, but require some some database expertise to be able to really harness the power of it. I mean, there's a lot of features of Spatial that are not super complicated to use, but in terms of just anyone being able to just get up off the ground and run with it, whether it's basic or more advanced things, that's what Studio is all about. And the other piece of context to reinforce here is that when Carol showed that big mile-high picture of Spatial and Graph and all the features in the database and the deployable components that come with it, remember that this is just one of those deployable components. It just comes along with Spatial and Graph, and you have Spatial and Graph, you have Studio, you can run it. So the pages that the Studio application includes are, right now I just logged in, we're looking at a home page, which is where we'll have projects, work that we create and save. We'll be doing that and saving one, coming back to it. The next page is the data page, where we define the connections to the sources of data, Oracle databases in our first release, and the individual data sets that we're going to work with. So the data that we're pointing at in the database to use for our spatial analysis and visualization. The next page in Studio is the active project page, which is where if we're in the midst of doing some analysis and visualization, this will be our canvas, and we'll also get to that in a moment. The next page is the jobs page, and as we'll see, this is the place where you can monitor ongoing work that's being done. If there's some longer running process in Spatial Studio that's going on behind the scenes while you're doing other work, you'll be able to monitor that progress here. And then finally, for an administrative user, just a typical admin page where you set up a bunch of the options, like setting up proxies, looking at logs and so forth. So a basic administrative page. So that's the lay of the land. And in terms of jumping in and getting going, it's really all about creating data sets and then working with those data sets. So a data set is just a construct in Spatial Studio where we are basically pointing at data in the database to use with Spatial Studio. And that data can either already exist in Oracle database and we just want to connect to it and work with it, or it's data that we can load from standard formats and load to the database and then work with it in Studio. So that's what we're going to start with. Our first step is to create some data sets. So there's a Create button on the upper right. And as Carol mentioned also, anyone that's worked with Oracle DV, Oracle Data Visualization, Oracle DV within the Oracle Analytics Cloud or Data Visualization Desktop, this is going to be a very familiar user experience because we've brought ourselves sort of in line with that sort of user experience pattern. It's worked really well, and this is a really effective sort of companion tool to that broader analytics platform. So we create here our artifacts. As you can see, we could create projects, data sets, or new connections. And in this case, we've already got a connection. It already exists. There's a default connection that is set up when you first start Studio. So we're simply going to jump right to creating a new data set. And as I mentioned, creating a data set is either going to mean either grabbing some data that's in a database that we have a connection to, or loading some data from our local file system from one of these standard formats. And that will either be a spreadsheet in order to load just some tabular data that we want to work with. Of course, from a spreadsheet, there's some preparation that will be required, or from a shapefile to load geospatial data. And we are planning on adding GeoJSON to that very shortly. So our first example is going to be to load from a spreadsheet. So I'm just going to go and grab a spreadsheet, and I apologize if anyone can hear my dog barking. He does this on cue whenever I least want him to. So I'm going to pause this for 1 second and do something about that. So give me about 5 seconds.
That's great.
Okay, my apologies. A rabbit runs through the front yard and he goes crazy. Okay, so I have selected a spreadsheet that I want to load, and we have a dialog that's giving us a little preview of what that spreadsheet contains. I can see it's just a bunch of information. This happens to be, as you can see, vendor names or a bunch of car dealerships, but we have businesses, these businesses with address data and some other attributes. And my options here are to specify the connection to upload it to. Essentially, what database will this be loaded to? I have one default connection created, and a name of a table that'll be created. So I'm just going to leave these defaults and let this load. And I'm being prompted for to notify me that as this is running, there's going to be a process bar. This was small data set, so it was pretty quick. But you also notice here that once this data set was loaded, I now have a row in this data sets list, and it's this table that I've just created, and there's a little table icon next to it with a little alert message that when I click on is going to inform me that we've loaded this table. It's a data set in Studio. However, in order to work with it in Studio, we need to do some preparation since it was just a spreadsheet with address data. So we're going to go ahead and perform that preparation. So I can click the menu for this data set, and there's a prepare menu. And the preparations that we perform in our first release are to geocode address data. So that's data down to the postal address level, or it could be to a higher level like a municipality or a city, and we'll create points to the best degree that we can resolve them from the input data. In this case, we do have addresses. And we can also work with latitude, longitude data and create an index, a spatial index on that data as well to prepare it. But in this case, we have addresses. So I'm going to select geocode addresses. And the dialog that comes up now is displaying for us several things. First of all, it's showing us all the columns with sort of a carousel of distinct values. So we can see what's contained in those columns. But on the far left column under geotype is where Spatial Studio has determined what geographic types each of those columns contain that are useful for geocoding. So it's determined that the column called address line 1 contains addresses, city contains cities. Those seem self-evident because of the column names, but the column names could be anything. And Spatial Studio is introspecting and looking into those values and determining a pattern that looks like a postal address. So it looks like Studio has made a good selection for all of those items. If for some reason we had a situation where we needed to adjust this, say for example there were 3 or 4 different sets of address fields in a spreadsheet, I can manually pick which ones I want to use and specify the columns I want manually. But in this case, this looks fine. So I'm going to proceed and with this preparation, with this geocoding preparation, and click apply. This will now perform the geocoding. And as this is proceeding, I can go back to that jobs tab that I mentioned before, and I can watch this process running. It's going to be pretty quick because this is a small amount of data. If this was a longer running process, I just see it moving along. But in this case, it's completed. One thing that we'll notice here is that this row for my addresses data set has now, the icon has changed to a pin to indicate that data is now prepared. That warning message is gone, and I could now start working with this data. One of the things that we feel was very important was to not only provide this simple preparation of your data like addresses from a spreadsheet, but to provide visibility into what exactly was done, because we've had the experience providing this kind of capability that geocoding may be performed, and then people put it on a map, and some of it looks right, and some of it's out in the middle of the ocean or in the wrong continent, and it's sort of a black box why. So we provide visibility into exactly what the process performed. If we go back into that geocoding dialog, we can see several things. We can see a summary that's showing us the total number of rows input, how many were an exact match to locate those addresses, and we can also see how many were matched with some possible ambiguity that we might want to take a look at. And then finally, down at the bottom is just a database query that for someone that's a little more hands-on, you could go in and literally run this query and in the database, and it would show you all the details about exactly what was matched, what was not perfectly matched, and why. Now, there's no requirement to go in and look at this stuff, but it's just important for visibility. Okay, so we can also look at the individual rows that were ambiguous, meaning there was more than one way to interpret a result. Like, for example, if we just had a street address and a city name, but not a state name, well, if that address could be in more than one state, it's ambiguous. One Main Street Springfield could exist in a dozen different states. So we pick the one that we think is most likely, but give you the opportunity to make a choice if it was ambiguous, and similar with other situations where it's not a perfect match. Okay, so that's a fair amount of detail on that case. Now the next case is loading some existing geographic data, geospatial data, from a shapefile. So I'm going to grab a shapefile with these custom regions in it and load it. And in this case, it's pretty straightforward because the shapefile's already geospatial. It's going to be ready to use immediately. So I'm just going to review the shapefile. If I wanted to change the table name that will be created, I could. But once this is complete, I will now have a second data set, and it'll have a pin icon next to it automatically because, again, it's a geospatial format off the shelf immediately. The last data set that I'm going to create will be one from a table that already exists in the database. Remember, I don't have to load from the file system. I can grab existing tables. So looking at the tables that we have in here, I can see a couple things. First of all, the addresses and the regions are the tables that were created by the loading that I just performed. But there's also a table called Texas Coastal Zone. I know that's a table with geometries in it that I want to use. It's a region of interest that I want to use in my spatial analysis. So I'm just going to use that table directly, and we'll see that once again we'll have another data set added. It'll have a little pin, and it's ready to use. Now we're ready to start with. We've got the data sets that we need. We're going to start doing some work with them. And but before I do that, I just want to mention that at this point, if we wanted to, you'll see that in this menu for data sets, there's several options. One of the options that you see is export data set. And so any data set that we create, and as you'll see in a couple of minutes, any analysis that we perform, we can export as either a GeoJSON file, so a geographic format that could be used to integrate with another system. You could load it as a custom layer in Oracle Data Visualization, for example, and it can also be the attributes portion can also be exported as a CSV file. So we can get the data in, we can get the data out, but what we really want to do is work with it in Studio, do analysis and visualization. And the scenario and what we're going to do next is to work with this data as follows. We have a bunch of points that we've geocoded. This is all in the state of Texas. So we have these addresses that we've geocoded. We have a bunch of custom regions. Those might be sales territories or other types of reporting regions. And then we have this coastal area of interest. And what I want to do, the exercise that I want to do, are really two pieces of spatial analysis or enrichment that I want to do on those addresses. We've already geocoded the addresses, but then we want to also determine for each one of those geocoded locations which region is it contained in, because we might want to do something like do some aggregations or summarizing information from that individual point location and summarize it at the region level. And we also want to know how far away is each of those locations from this coastal area, because there's some There could be some implications in terms of business business scenarios that are based on the distance from a coastal zone. For example, if that was some type of environmentally sensitive area, there's certain types of activities that can occur within a certain distance from that type of area. So those are the things that I want to do, and now we can start to do them in Studio. And we begin by the very first thing that I'm going to do, actually, that I forgot to mention, is that each data set in Studio has a key, a unique identifier that we use. And I'm going to actually set that key right now for my regions, and I'm going to set it to be this region value, because when I do the work I'm about to do in Studio, I'm going to want to use that region as a tag. I want to tag each of my locations with a region. So I'm going to set that as the key, and once I do that, I'll be able to begin. So I'm going to begin by grabbing my addresses and saying create project. That'll just create a brand new empty project canvas with my addresses, geocoded addresses, already loaded and ready to use. So as you can see, now I'm on that project canvas page. I have my addresses data set. It was loaded. I've added a map to my canvas, and we're going to start to work with our data now. So I drag and drop my addresses in, and they're located based on the geocoding that we did. We can change the look and feel of what we see pretty easily. So I'm just going to go in and change the color and the opacity, make them not so see-through and a different color. We can also change our background map to one of a few styles. This is just jumping through a sort of a grayscale style or a dark style or just the default bright style. They each have different sort of scenarios that they work best in. I'll just leave it using this default style. The first thing I want to do is determine which region each of those locations are in. So I'm going to add now data set of those regions, drag and drop those regions in. This is what I loaded from a shapefile, and I now have my regions. So what I want to do is start to determine which, for each of these locations, I want to tag it with the region name that it's in. But before doing that, we'll sort of build up to that with a couple of other sort of simple steps to show some basic spatial analysis. One of the first things that one might want to do here, even before doing that, is to identify, say, which of these locations is contained in a particular area of interest. So if I had one of these regions and I just wanted to know which of these locations is contained in that region, that's about the most straightforward sort of hello world type spatial analysis example we're going to have. So we'll use that as our first example. So to do that, I have clicked on, and I'm going to apologize and rewind. So to do that, I'm going to click on a region of interest, and then I'm going to click on the menu for this layer and pick spatial analysis. And what that opens up for us is the dialog, is the spatial analysis dialog in Spatial Studio. This is where all of those, or most of those, spatial operators and functions and things that Carol briefly showed in the slide deck that are SQL-based operations that you sort of need to know just a little bit about how to work with SQL in the database, where all of that stuff is presented in a self-service sort of drag and drop user experience. So they're organized in terms of different types of operations, filter operations, which is what we're going to do. We want to filter all of our locations to just the ones in a region of interest. But there's also other operations to do things like combining multiple shapes into one, and transforming from one type of geometry to another, like transforming a shape into a buffered area surrounding the shape and measuring things and so forth. So as I mentioned, so combining things, transforming them, doing measurements, but we're going to do a basic filter operation to start with. Return shapes that are inside another. So what we're going to do to start with is I just want to know which of these geocoded locations are contained in the area that I just clicked on. So to do that, I have at the very top of this form, as the labels describe, a name for the result. I'll just leave it with the default addresses inside. The layer that I'm filtering are my addresses. What do I want to filter them by? I want to filter them by the regions. And in particular, I want to filter them by the region that I selected in the map. And that's what this little label and switch here is telling us. It's saying that I want to filter, but only by the item that I selected in the map. And that's all I have to do. Filter the addresses by the region I selected in the map. And when I do that, I now have a result sitting under analyses in the tree, which I can drag and drop in. And now I have a result which are just those addresses. Now, if we take a look at the properties of that result, we'll see a couple interesting things. First of all, we'll see the SQL behind that analysis. So literally down to the level of the SQL operator, the SDO inside spatial operator that was used. This could be copied and pasted and run if you wanted to use it just as a way to generate basic spatial SQL. But it's just, again, providing visibility into exactly what happened behind the scenes to do this kind of query. And above that, we see a GeoJSON endpoint. So a RESTful endpoint that can be used to access this analysis result. So work that you do in Studio, the data sets themselves, but probably more importantly, the analysis results that you create can be accessed programmatically. So you could do work in Studio, create some analyses, and then they can be accessed and integrated in sort of open-ended fashion using the REST endpoints that are created. So that's sort of the hello world point in Polygon type example. But the next example will be to take this one small step further and say, what if I have two regions and I want to filter I want to know which locations are in either of those two regions. And beyond that, I want to know not only which are located in those two regions, but since each one might be in one region or the other, I want to know which region it's in. So it's a little bit more than last time where it was sort of a yes or no, is a location in this region or not. Now I want to know, is it in one of these regions, and if so, which one? So again, it's going to be filtering based on the regions that I selected. But now this item down at the bottom becomes important because I'm going to say I want to include the key from those regions in the result. What that'll give me is a result which are the filtered set of locations, the locations in one of those regions, and it will include the region name in the result. And that's exactly what I want. So I'm going to let this run. Now I already have an analysis called Texas addresses inside, so I'll just give it a unique name, let that run, and we'll have a result similar to what we had before, which I can drag and drop in. And now we'll see that these will be, of course, the locations contained by the two areas I selected. And now we can do take a look at what we created. Now in the interaction tab, I can define behavior like info windows and tooltips. I'm going to say I'd like an info window, a pop-up showing us the name and the region for each of the items as locations as I click on them. So as I click around, I'm seeing now that, yeah, we did in fact now capture the region that each of these locations is contained by. That's a little closer to what I wanted. I just did that for two regions. But what we want to do is actually do it for all of the locations and all the regions. I basically want to know for every location, what region is it contained by. So I'm simply going to do the exact same thing I just did. And I'm going to call this result Texas addresses with region. And I'm once again just going to say I want to take my addresses and I want to filter them by regions, but I'm not going to limit them by anything. I want all the regions, and I want to include the key from the region in the result. So now that I've done that, I'll just drag and drop that result in again, and we will now have every one of our geocoded locations and every one tagged with the region that it's contained by. So now as I go back, I could go back to my interaction tab and say, maybe I'll do tooltips instead of an info window just to mix it up a little. And I'll say I want the tooltip to be the region. So as I mouse over these locations now, I'm going to see the region that the location is contained by. So now we've done essentially what in technical terms one would sort of consider to be a spatial join between all the locations and all the regions. And that's a very sort of useful general purpose sort of thing to do, is to take a whole bunch of locations and a bunch of regions and figure out which region every one of them is contained by. And again, the reason for doing this, a typical reason for doing this, is so that you could then say, I want to do some type of calculations for these individual locations, but then summarize, average them, or sum them by region. And that's a very sort of typical analytic sort of workflow to do. So we've done that first piece, which is to calculate the region for every location. But the second piece that we wanted to do was to enrich, if you will, these locations with something else, and that's the distance from each of these locations to an area, a particular area of interest. So I've added the coastal zones in, and I'm going to drag and drop that coastal zone into the map, and I'll just give it a little bit of a different style so that it stands out a little bit more. And then what I want to do is add another, basically add another enrichment, perform another analysis to determine the distance from each location to that area of interest. Now, we just finished doing an analysis where we added the region to the locations. That's Texas addresses with regions. I just want to add to that. I don't want to create another sort of separate analysis that has this distance. I want one composite result that has everything in it. So I'm going to now do an analysis of that previous analysis, essentially chaining together kind of a multi-step analysis process. Analysis step 1 was to add the region to the locations. Analysis step 2 is going to be to add the distance. So I'm going to take that addresses with region, and I'm going to perform an analysis on it. So I'm going to say spatial analysis on my first result, sort of chaining these together, and now I'm going to go to the measure tab, and the measurement that I want to perform is to measure the minimum distance between shapes. There's lots of other types of measurements we could do. It could have been the maximum distance between two shapes, but we're going to pick the minimum distance between each of our geocoded locations and the coastal area. So I'll give a name to my result, addresses with region and distance. I can give a name for the column, the measurement column that'll be created, and that'll be distance, and I'm going to use miles. And I want to calculate the distance between that addresses with region result and that coastal zone. Now, in this case, there's only one coastal zone. I didn't have to select amongst many, so there's no selection that I made of coastal zones that is relevant here. I do want to change the units that will be used to miles. And since there's only one coastal zone, the other key is meaningless. Doesn't matter. There's only one coastal zone. So I run this now, and that's it. That's all we had to do this distance calculation and essentially chain it together and add it to our previous result. So now I have, of course, yet another analysis result that I can drag and drop into the map, and that's going to be, again, my geocoded points, really with everything in it now that I wanted, with the regions and the distance calculation in there. So I can sort of drag this out, make sure I'm looking at the analysis that I wanted, and we can start to maybe look into this and confirm that it has in it what we expect. So I'm going to add an info window now to pop up and show me the distance that we just created, the name of the point, and the region number, which is what we did previously. So I can see distance, the point's name, and the region. We can poke around, and we can see that that's now been calculated. All that decimal degree, there's a lot of decimal precision in there that is making that number look long and complicated, but it's really just a double precision distance in miles. And you also see when I click on a point that's inside that coastal area, of course, the distance is 0 as we'd expect. So we've done really the things that we wanted to do started from just a raw spreadsheet and a couple of a raw spreadsheet, a shapefile, and a table, geocoded that spreadsheet to get points, determine which region each of those points is in, and then the distance from each of those points to this area of interest. Again, because it may be that we want to focus work on points in a particular set of reporting regions and narrow ourselves to locations that are at least a certain distance away from this environmentally sensitive area. For example, there's lots of reasons why this type of flow would be meaningful. We can take another little look in here at how we can maybe visualize our results a little bit more. So within a layer in our project, we can not only create tooltips and info windows, and as you saw, we can change the color of things, but we can also create data-driven styling. So that would mean, for example, having the size or color of something be based on data. For example, this distance that we created. So I'm going to make the radius, the size of these symbols, be, instead of being a single value, I'm going to have them be based on data. So change it to be based on data. What data? I want it to be based on distance. So now I can just say from what are the distance ranges that I want to use to drive the sizes, how many distance bins do I want to create, and then I can just set the sizes that I want for those symbols. This is just a very basic example of how to quickly visualize and see something in the data and make sure it meets our gut check. Yeah, we want to see that those symbols are getting bigger and bigger as we move further and further away from that coastal area. We could do some similar things with colors and so forth, but just a basic example of a little styling. The other thing that we want to do is to save our work so we can always come back to exactly where we left off. Before I do that, actually, we can also do a little bit of filtering on the client side in the tool. So if I want, remember, we added region as an attribute, so I can just filter just in the client to region by just picking region as a column in our filter tab and poking through some different region values. But really what I want to do now is to save my work. So I can click Save for the project, give the project a name, and now this is stored with everything that we see here. I can always come back to this later and pick right up where I left off. The other thing I might want to do is to create a streamlined or stripped down version of this that I can share with other users as a basic interactive mapping web page where users can control the look and feel but not do new analyses or make changes, do anything that would change things in the back end. Just a read-only sort of simple view of this project. So there's my project that we just created, and I'm just refreshing. As I refresh Studio, I now see that I also published this project, and when I click on that published view, we'll see that the published project is, again, as I just said, a stripped down version of our full Studio project that doesn't have the ability to add new data sets, create new analyses, do things that would make any changes in the back end, but it's just the sort of the front end view. I can go in and change the styling and the look and feel and turn layers on and off and move them up and down in the rendering order. So now, I mean, that's sort of a end-to-end within Studio. And early on in the demo, when I showed you that export capability, that's where if you happen to be an OAC user or a DV user in particular, you might say this was the prep I needed. I wanted to create these layers that I want to now jump over and do work with, maybe in Oracle DV. I can get everything I see here out and into DV very easily. This can all be pushed out as a CSV file, which we can load as a data set. Everything we see as a spatial layer can be pushed out as a GeoJSON file, which can be loaded as a custom map layer in DV. And we can just have sort of a continual, sort of a seamless movement of everything we see into the full OAC analytics environment. But similarly, we had GeoJSON endpoints for everything we see. So we can access all this programmatically and work with it from whatever tool we want. And everything we've built is also just sitting in the database. So we could go above and beyond and do additional things in the back end as well, just in the database. So that sort of concludes a very simple walkthrough of a basic example of doing a couple of basic spatial operations in Studio. And I think Carol will now, I'll stop sharing, Carol can jump through sort of reinforcing or summarizing what we saw and sort of putting a kind of a ribbon around this from the overview perspective. So Carol, I'll stop sharing now.
Okay, so just kind of summarize what you just saw through the demo. From functionality perspective, on the data side, you can access content from Oracle database. You can load local files. You saw David load shapefiles, spreadsheets, and soon to be GeoJSON. We can prepare data in a couple ways. You can geocode addresses, create long indexes. You noted that you can export as CSV files or GeoJSON to DB, and you can pre-cache vector tiles for better performance. From projects perspective, similar to DB, you can combine data sets, create visualizations, perform spatial analysis operations very easily, and you can save the results. You can go back, you can edit the results, add data sets, save it again, share results with others. You can publish those results. You can also share with DB. Developer perspective, Studio is geared to the general business user. However, there are things that you can get out of it, some benefits from using Studio. You can get access to that analysis SQL that David showed you. So if you want to, take information on how to do a specific query, you can copy and paste, use it outside of Studio. You can take published content, you can integrate it with other applications very easily, and you can access data sets and analyses. They're all accessible via REST endpoints. From an administrative point of view, I'm not going to go into much of this. There is the console user interface. You can configure geocoding service endpoints. And most importantly, you can look at those jobs that you're working on, see what's going on with them. If you need to make any adjustments, you can do that very easily. Licensing. One thing I want to mention is Studio is included with all autonomous database subscriptions that include Spatial and Graph. So when I showed you that, when we talked about the components page that were included with Spatial and Graph, Studio is one of them. There's no extra charge for it. It comes with the Spatial and Graph option if you're licensed for that. Okay, and there are 6 subscriptions here listed that you can use Studio with, because Spatial and Graph option are included in those subscriptions, as well as Oracle Database Enterprise Edition on-prem. Technical requirements, there's a minimum of 12.2 that's required. The repository database must include Spatial and Graph. You need a minimum of 12.2.1.3 and JDK 8 only. You can find more of this when you go to the oracle.com page. Get started. There are 2 ways to do that. We do offer the quickstart, which is more a sandbox environment. It comes pre-deployed in a Jetty container. You just download, unzip, and run it. It's pretty easy. We also have a Java EE deployment that you can get from Oracle Service Delivery Cloud or Oracle Technical Resources, which is formerly known as OTN. We are planning quarterly releases, and there's just a download page. Again, you can just go to Studio on Oracle.com and find that information pretty quickly. The limitations that I told you to be aware of at the very beginning, we only have spatial filters right now in V1. For analysis editing, that's not possible. You'd have to just restart from scratch again to do another analysis, because you cannot edit analysis in V1. Database is the only source, and in V1, there's no GeoJSON upload. Just to be aware of. So now, if there are any questions in chat, can do that. And then I just have a few more slides just to summarize and where you can access more information.
So Carol and David, there were a couple of questions on the chat. I believe Shiva's already addressed those in the chat.
Okay. All right, let me just continue then with a few more slides and just see if people have questions coming up. Resources, I just want to point this out to you. You will have access to these slides. There is the product homepage for Spatial Graph, where you can access Spatial Graph and Studio as well. However, we do have a Studio homepage, which I just showed you, which has everything all in one place, the blogs, the forum, also YouTube, Twitter, etc.
Hey, Carol, I want to mention that forum.
Yep.
there. I put it in, that's the spatial forum, and we have a subpage
Oh.
for Spatial Studio. I put it in the chat.
Okay, I'm glad you saw. I didn't even pay attention to that. Yes, it should be the studio one, but Spatial's available as well.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'll have to update that. It's a good catch. All right, the next session will be in October. Not sure what the topic will be yet, but you can also view the recordings, look at all the information from past sessions, submit feedback, questions, whatever. You can email me, David, and anybody on the team. Also wanted to point out the Spatial and Graph SIG user community. We have a great group. If you want to become involved with us, we'd love to have more people join the group. Do a lot of interesting and fun things.